right. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Thank you for joining today to this webinar, DMDU webinar series. Let's start. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Nidhi Karla, a senior information scientist from the RAND Corporation. She's going to talk about how DMDU can be used for analyzing the policy context of autonomous vehicles. Just as a reminder, this is a weekly ongoing webinar series in which various senior researchers from the DMDU community will be sharing their thoughts and their ideas, the recent research on DMDU. Here you're seeing the roster. Next week we will have Julie Rosenberg from the World Bank to talk about how DMDU can be used to analyze policy reduction policies. A reminder to everyone is that in November this year, we will be hosting in Tecnológico de Monterrey the DMDU annual meeting to be held November 10, November 12. Please check out our website for seeing the details of the annual meeting. And very important, we are approaching the deadline for submitting a session proposal for this annual meeting. Please visit this link and make sure you revise all the different formats that you can use to submit a session. And we are looking forward to hearing from you. So next week, Julie Rosenberg will talk about poverty reduction or deep uncertainty. Please put that on your calendars as well. I'm sure it's going to be also an interesting seminar. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker today, Nidhi Karla, senior information scientist from the RAND Corporation. She has previously served as a director of RAND San Francisco Bay Area office and co-director of RAND Center for Decision Making Under Uncertainty. Her research focuses on an autonomous vehicle policy, climate change adaptation, and tools and methods that help people and organizations make better decisions amid deep uncertainty. She spearheads RAND's autonomous vehicle policy work. Karla is the lead author of the study Driving to Safety: How Many Miles of Driving Would It Take to Demonstrate Autonomous Vehicles Reliably? And co-author of the flagship report Autonomous Vehicle Technology: A Guide for Policymakers. She has over 10 years of experience in autonomous vehicle policy and is committed to using her expertise to further evidence-based policymaking. She has testified on autonomous vehicle policy at 3 congressional hearings. Dr. Karla also helps organizations improve how they make robust decisions, particularly in the face of climate change. In 2018, Karla served as Senior Technology Policy Advisor to U.S. Senator Kamala Harris. In 2013, she served as a Senior Decision Scientist in the Office of the Chief Economist of Sustainable Development at the World Bank, where she helped launch the World Bank's portfolio in robust decision-making. Karla developed educational technology tools to promote literacy among blind children in India, a project that went on to receive the Louis Braille Touch of Genius Prize for Innovation. She received her PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University Robotics Institute. So as you can see, we are very honored, Nidhi, to have you here. It's a pleasure to hear from you. And without further delay, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. And I hope everyone is staying safe and staying sane out there. Here we go. I'm going to start with a short video that's really going to let the cat out of the bag. And then I will go into my presentation. Edmundo, stop me if you can't hear this.
The main argument for mass deployment of autonomous vehicles is the number of lives that could be saved. But how do you put a number on that when the outcome is affected by so many variables? Some say that AVs must be nearly perfect before we deploy, because imperfect technology would cost lives. Others point out that human drivers are far from perfect, that over 30,000 people a year already die on America's roads, almost all due to human error. So we should get AVs on the road as soon as they drive better than we do. So which plan is safer? To find out, we have to project future road fatalities if AVs were never introduced. Next, we estimate how quickly developers can improve AVs after they've been introduced and how quickly conventional vehicles get replaced. Now we can estimate the lives saved under 2 scenarios: nearly perfect AVs and ones that are just better than the average driver. If nearly perfect AVs prevent 29,000 of 30,000 annual deaths, it's a no-brainer to put them on the road. But when does that happen? How long have you waited for them to be perfected? And how many people have died in the meantime? It turns out that introducing AVs when they are less than perfect, when they're merely better than the average human driver, may actually save more lives in the long run, because we're introducing them sooner. We're not waiting. As a result, they get safer, faster. Once they're on the road, developers would have more data to improve them than they do with their small test fleets. The technology improves more rapidly, more people replace their old cars sooner, and still more lives can be saved. In fact, under every combination of future adoption and performance conditions we examined, introducing AVs when they're less than perfect led to fewer cumulative road fatalities over a 30-year period. In some cases, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. While postponing the introduction of AVs until they're nearly perfect might seem safer in the short term, it could ultimately be the more dangerous choice. But are we really ready to let go of the steering wheel? We have to ask ourselves, what puts us at greater risk? Imperfect machines or imperfect human beings? And if we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, we must consider the critical factor of time.
Okay, well, my work here is done. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Just kidding. So that was a very short video we made for the lay audience to give them a taste of what this work is about. But let me get to it in greater detail. So this is work we did a couple of years ago, I and my colleague Dave Groves, who will actually be presenting on a different topic in a few weeks. The enemy of good, estimating the cost of waiting for nearly perfect automated or autonomous vehicles. So as many of you are probably aware, road fatalities are on the rise in the United States, particularly in recent years. Over the last many decades, there's been a decline, but in part because of increased vehicle miles traveled, but also perhaps because of distracted driving, there's been a recent and really disturbing uptick in road fatalities. In fact, the last few years have been the worst in terms of fatalities than we've seen in decades. And by some estimates, the cost is nearly $1 trillion a year when all the costs are factored in. And the vast majority are caused by, or at least have a significant contribution from human error, meaning someone is not paying attention, they're distracted, they've lost control of the vehicle, they can't see, they're, all kinds of factors that mean that a person who makes a mistake can end up losing their lives. Now, many hope that autonomous vehicles, sometimes called automated vehicles, will make transportation safe because unlike people, these vehicles are never tired, they're never distracted, they always have their eyes on the road. And here, when I say autonomous vehicle, I'm talking about vehicles that can drive themselves some of the time or all of the time. But even though there's this hope that autonomous vehicles will make transportation safe, there's a recognition that they pose risks as well, especially in the near term. This is a photo of a fatal crash in 2018 that happened in the peninsula just south of San Francisco with Tesla's autopilot. So not quite the level of sophistication that we are talking about in this study, but already we are seeing autonomy cost lives. So the question that we asked ourselves in this research was, how safe should autonomous vehicles be before they are allowed on the road for consumer use? And there's really two large schools of thought here. One is that we should put them on the roads when they are just safer than the average human driver. This is a utilitarian point of view. Once they're better than average, they can on aggregate start saving lives, even though in the near term, they may cost some lives, cause some crashes. The alternative view is that they need to be significantly safer than humans, or even nearly perfect. Because while we may, as a society, may accept mistakes from each other, we don't accept mistakes from machines. And so the question, these two policies, if you will, or ways of looking at this are differences in values, differences in preferences, differences in understanding of technology and willingness to hand over control, difference in understanding what it takes to save a life now versus save a life later. But our view is that this debate, which is a subjective debate largely, can be informed by evidence and analysis. And that's what we try to do, is to say which of these two policies, introduce them when they're just better than the average human driver or when they're nearly perfect, what is the consequence of these two policy choices? Now, this is, although such a policy decision is made at, at a point in time, it's really affecting the trajectory of road safety over time. And this matters for several reasons. First is that the autonomous vehicle impact on road safety will be far greater in the future than it is today, because it takes a generation sometimes to turn over the vehicle fleet. So the effects today of any particular policy will be small, whichever one you choose, because we'll have tens, 1,000 autonomous vehicles maybe in the first year of deployment. And the question really becomes, what does the world look like 10, 20, 30 years from now when we've got much more uptake of this technology? The second reason to look over time is that safety isn't going to be static. The point at which they're introduced, the safety that they have when they're allowed on the roads today, won't be the safety they have 10, 20, 30 years from now. Safety will improve. It will particularly improve with experience. A key factor for the improvement of autonomous vehicle safety is actually the driving experience they have. They're a bit like teenage drivers, where when you first put them on the road, they may not be that safe. But through experience, as they mature as an industry, we can expect the technology to get safer. And the question is, how quickly will the technology get safer? A third factor is that the use of AVs is expected to increase travel demand, because they decrease the cost of driving by giving people back the value of their time. And so when you decrease the cost of a good for which there's latent demand, the demand will go up. So we expect to see people travel more, which will affect the number of fatalities we see on the roads. A final factor is that human driver performance is itself changing. With, on the one hand, we have cell phones and other media in our vehicles that are making us more distracted drivers. On the other hand, we have driver assistance technologies like lane keeping, which they're not autonomous vehicles, but they are supporting human driver performance. So our counterfactual, our baseline is itself changing. And these changes are all taking place over time. So it's not enough to consider this policy question in a moment. We have to consider it over the coming decades. Now, these factors are all deeply uncertain. And let me reiterate, deep uncertainty is uncertainty that exists because we don't know or we can't agree on the values of a particular outcome, or the probabilities of certain outcomes, or the models and the model parameters we might use to predict those things. So under those conditions, we're dealing with a deep kind of uncertainty that we can't adjudicate simply with better predictions, with better models. It really is that we have an inherent kind of uncertainty. And in this problem space, there are many of these uncertainties. One is, when will AVs be introduced into the marketplace and how will they be adopted and diffused? Essentially, when will they reach that threshold of performance that we say is acceptable? And then how quickly will they replace conventional vehicles? How widely will they replace conventional vehicles? How will their safety performance improve over time? That's not really known. And how will the use and performance of regular vehicles evolve as a counterfactual? And therefore, this makes this problem of autonomous vehicle safety a clear decision-making under deep uncertainty problem. Now, forgive me, I didn't realize I was early on in the slate of presentations, so I'm going to swap over and talk a minute about what DMDU looks like. So I'm going to describe DMDU by contrasting it with traditional methods. So traditional methods, which would include Monte Carlo analyses, for example, employ what we would call an agree on assumptions approach. It starts by the parties to a decision saying, what are the future conditions going to be? What's the world going to look like? Then turning some model crank and saying, well, under those conditions, what is the best near-term decision? And then we might do some sensitivity analysis and say, okay, we'll twiddle the inputs by 10% and see how sensitive our decision is to those conditions. But under conditions of deep uncertainty, this approach often underestimates the uncertainties because the sensitivity analysis is too small. Competing analyses can contribute to gridlock. By that I mean someone comes up with a different set of assumptions or uses a different model or comes up with a different analysis, and now we have no way of determining which one, or we have no good way of determining which analysis is the right analysis. And finally, there's a pressure. The process itself places pressure to be as concrete as possible, sometimes to show certainty where there isn't any. And that can blind decision makers to surprise. This kind of a process puts blinders on us, asks us to say, what is our best guess at what will happen, to the exclusion of all the things that might happen, but might be less likely. So with DMDU, we flip this around. Under deeply uncertain conditions, it's often useful to do this in reverse. So we start, rather than discovering the strategy, we start with a strategy and we exercise it, essentially stress test it to find out when does this strategy meet our goals and when does it fail to meet our goals. And then we develop adaptations to reduce those vulnerabilities. So rather than optimizing to a particular prediction, we are trying to cultivate a strategy that works in as many future conditions as possible. In particular, for this analysis, we use robust decision-making, which sort of takes an iterative approach to this backwards way of thinking about things. We start with decision structuring, number one here, which involves laying out the key elements of the analysis, which I'll get into. Then using the key elements of the analysis, in particular, lots of future states of the world, we stress test our policies and generate a whole bunch of cases that say this policy under these conditions produces this output. We use a huge database of cases from step 2 to do a vulnerability analysis. The vulnerability analysis asks, when do each of our strategies work and when do they fail to work? And those are the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities are the conditions under which a particular strategy fails. That can motivate the development of new options if, for example, a combination of strategies would result in fewer vulnerabilities. And at the end, we get to a trade-off analysis, which says, what is the trade-off between different characteristics of different strategies, such as cost, and then robustness? And in the end, ideally, one chooses a robust strategy. So for this autonomous vehicle problem, what you'll see is going through decision structuring, case generation, vulnerability analysis, and we leave open really the trade-offs because this is not a closed problem yet. So let me go back to, here we are. So as I say, this is a clear DMDU problem. And so we start by understanding what are the questions we're trying to answer. Question 1 is, under what conditions are more lives saved by waiting for perfection, by waiting for perfect autonomous vehicles, and how much are those savings? Question 2 is, how likely are the conditions under which waiting for perfection is better? And by that I mean better than deploying when they're just better than the average human. And the third is, what does this mean for policies governing the introduction of AVs for consumer use? And we'll come back to these questions one by one. So you may have seen this in the previous speakers' presentations, or it might be new for you, but a lot of decision framing involves articulating the factors of an analysis. We start by articulating what are the policy levers we're trying to evaluate. And here we have two. One is a policy I'll nickname just better. And what that means is this is the policy of introducing autonomous vehicles when they are just better than the average human driver. And the competing policy is to wait until autonomous vehicles are almost perfect. So we've got just better and almost perfect. And what we're asking is, how do these policies perform according to two metrics in particular? One is cumulative fatalities over time, and the other is the fatality rate, cumulative fatalities per vehicle mile traveled, which is a standard metric in transportation. So for those who aren't familiar, a vehicle mile traveled is how many miles does a vehicle travel, as opposed to person mile traveled, which is how many miles does a person travel. So fatalities per VMT or 100 million VMT is a pretty key transportation metric. And we're measuring these two in the short term, what I would say is 15 years, and long term, 30 years. The challenge, of course, is that we are faced with deep uncertainties that I've described, the change in the safety of AVs and non-AVs over time, the travel demand for non-AVs, the timing, the rate, the level of AV market diffusion. So this is a summary of a whole lot of variables in our model that we really can't pin a number on. And the model we're using is the RAND model of autonomous vehicle safety. It basically takes policies about when to introduce autonomous vehicles and examines how those policies perform over time under a bunch of deep uncertainties according to cumulative fatalities and cumulative fatalities per VMT. So the model pulls all these three boxes together. So we have this model, and here's the model is actually interactive. So afterwards, you're most welcome to go and play with the model yourself. This is a scenario one can construct where we say autonomous vehicles are introduced, let's say in the year 2020, when they are a little safer. This is the just better policy compared to human drivers. And let's also say that autonomous vehicles make up eventually 80% of vehicle travel 40 years later. And at this point, they're nearly perfect. They reach near perfection. The model takes these inputs, runs them over time. And in this particular scenario, deploying autonomous vehicles when they're just better than the average human driver saves 1.1 million lives. And what you're seeing on this plot here is time on the horizontal axis and fatalities, annual fatalities on the vertical axis. You can see that without AVs, we might, under this scenario, eventually reach 60,000 fatalities per year. But with AVs, that may drop suddenly as autonomous vehicles replace travel and they become safer over time. We contrast this with a second scenario in which they're still deployed when they're just a little safer, but hold on, I have sorry, I think here we go, forgive me. In this scenario, autonomous vehicles aren't introduced until 2035 when they're almost perfect. So we've had to wait longer to deploy them. And it takes 30 years for diffusion to occur. So less than before, for example, because now they're nearly perfect. And they remain almost perfect. So their performance started great, remained great. But this actually reduced the number of lives saved because they were deployed later. And so fewer lives were saved over time. These are just two tiny futures. What we did is we ran this kind of a simulation in 500 cases, 500 combinations of future conditions, and asked ourselves, under what conditions are more lives saved by waiting for perfection? And how much are those savings? So this is a plot of all 500 cases ordered from ordered according to the difference in cumulative fatalities. So let me explain what these colors are. Any red bars mean that waiting for perfection saves lives. The light blue bars mean waiting for perfection actually costs lives, but that cost is less than 50,000. And the dark blue means that waiting for perfection costs more than 50,000 lives, in some cases 200,000 lives, over 15 years. So what we're seeing here is that in the near term, there's very few cases where it makes sense to wait for perfection. And when we do, the savings are actually quite modest compared to the potential cost. But that's not enough because these are randomly generated cases. What we want to ask is, what's going on in these cases where waiting for perfection saves lives? What are the key characteristics about the world in which waiting for perfection makes sense? So our analysis said that in the near term, the just better policy almost always saves more lives, often by a lot if AV adoption is fast. So that's why you saw all those blue lines. Nearly perfect can be a bit safer in the near term, but only if, and these are the conditions, only if the adoption of AVs increases vehicle miles traveled, meaning people start driving a heck of a lot more, but that AV improvement is slow. So you've got a huge increase in vehicle miles traveled, and AVs don't improve equally fast to keep fatalities down. And as a result, there's more fatalities than there would be if we simply waited for perfection. We did the same analysis, I'm not going to show a plot, but we did the same analysis for the long term. In the long term, we found actually that just better, meaning deploying AVs when they're just better than the average human driver, is always better in all 500 cases. There's no red lines on that plot, it's all blue. Sometimes they're better, this policy is better by a lot, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of lives saved, if it takes a really long time to get to perfection, which we don't know if it's going to take a really long time, but if it does, then the lives saved by deploying early is going to be a lot. Sometimes it's only by a little. The advantage of deploying early is a little if nearly perfect AVs are around the corner. So this kind of makes intuitive sense, I hope. So now we've understood how these two policies perform and the conditions under which they perform one way versus another way. The next question we ask is, how likely are the conditions under which waiting for perfection is better? Well, we have to modify this because in the long term, it's never better. So we might say, how likely are the conditions under which waiting for perfection isn't too costly? Like it's clearly always costly, but it doesn't cost too many lives. And so what we're really asking is, how likely is it that nearly perfect AVs can be developed quickly? Because it is under this condition that they're developed quickly that the cost is small for the waiting for perfection policy. Well, how likely is it? Our subjective thinking is that it's not very likely at all. AV development has already taken 15 years, and we aren't near perfection, right? So the first AVs really were Waymo in 2005 deploying their, starting their program up. There's little reason too to believe that suddenly the improvements are going to be fast, given that deployment itself is actually key to improvement. So we haven't been able to deploy. So, if waiting and using laboratory tests to try to improve the technology is going to mean that development is slow. And the final reason that we shouldn't expect nearly perfect AVs anytime soon is that in general, the easiest safety improvements occur first, and the hardest ones are left for later. So getting from 50% reliability to 90% reliability might take 10 years, but getting from 90 to 99% reliability might take another 20 years. So there's not a lot of reason to be hopeful about nearly perfect AVs. What does this mean for policies governing the introduction of AVs? Well, we think it means a few things. In a truly utilitarian society, the answer would be clear. We should save millions of lives by allowing AVs when they are better than the average human driver. But we don't live in a utilitarian society, far, far from it. And at least one potentially negative consequence from this policy would be if there's a huge backlash to AVs when the AV crashes do occur, thus putting an absolute halt on the technology. So the answer ultimately isn't clear because it's not only a technocratic answer. The answer lies in how human beings respond to technological risk. It's good to know what being in a non-utilitarian society costs us, potentially millions and millions of lives. But in the end, the public, policymakers, even the judicial system and the transportation industry have to understand and balance the facts of crashes, the incidents of crashes, with the social acceptability of each kind of crash. Taking a step back, let's look at the general question: how should policymakers shape autonomous vehicle deployment? The first piece of advice we have for them is that they shouldn't try to predict the AV future. Predictions, if this pandemic shows us anything, it's that it's really hard to make predictions, especially about the future, as the saying goes. So we're not trying to predict the future, but we are trying to shape it, change it to our liking. And what that means is knowing that rapid deployment of autonomous vehicles is going to be essential to their improvement. That deploying in environments where risk can be managed well might be an important way to negotiate the tension between early deployment and ensuring safety. And the third factor is working to accelerate the learning and improvement by, as much as possible, sharing information across developers. And of course, not surprisingly, we encourage them to use DMDU techniques to manage this kind of uncertainty and to shape that future. So let me stop there. This is our report, The Enemy of Good, estimating the cost of waiting for nearly perfect autonomous vehicles. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Nidhi, for your presentation. We have a few questions on the Google form. Let me start there, and then we can open for questions in the audience. So sure. The first question I have here is from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Isn't it possible to forecast future technological developments based on the history of different technological platforms?
We continue to be surprised. I think what surprises me is how much we continue to think we can make good predictions, despite how often we are wrong about our predictions. So I think it's possible to make broad statements about technology. But let me. I'm reflecting on. I don't know if anyone remembers when the Segway was first introduced. I don't know if that was a niche thing in the United States or if everyone, the world was paying attention. But there was a big to-do that this was going to change, transform, revolutionize transportation, and it didn't. And we keep seeing this happen over and over again. And I think the hype cycle also is indicative of our difficulty in predicting the future. But I think the most difficult part about it is not just, it's easy to say, we're going to have autonomous vehicles on the road. The question is, how are they going to be deployed? How fast will they improve? The specifics continue to elude us.
Thank you, Nidhi. I have another question here, and maybe after this one we can open for the audience. Let me just read it here. The political backlash of people depending on these driving jobs is also very uncertain. Have you considered how that can affect the diffusion of alternative vehicles? Is that something that we should be worried about?
If I understand the question, I think it's asking, is there a backlash from labor, right? From self-driving and automation? Yeah, there may be, but if we look at automation in factories, automation in, it's already everywhere, and we have not seen the kind of backlash one might have expected given how many jobs are lost. So it is something to be very concerned about, since a lot of people make their livings as drivers of some sort. But I don't think that is going to be what stops this technology from rolling out, but rather that's a social issue, social and economic issue that needs to be addressed as the technology rolls out.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. I have a few questions more here on the Google form, but before going and to read them, is there anyone in the audience that wants to ask a question to Nidhi? You can do that just by unmuting your microphones, or if you can raise your hand virtually, you can raise your hand, and I will give you the floor. Michael, I see that you already unmuted yourself, so please go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. I'm impressed with the presentation. My questions go to two areas. The first is in terms of the technology itself. Have you inputted into the model the failure rate of the electronics involved? I'm thinking about some of the complaints that people are making about the Tesla system and how reliable it is over time, and whether that impacts the model that you guys are using. And then I've got one other question. Let me just see if I can meld it into this. And that is, how portable could this technology be in the front end? That's the good enough model. And what I'm thinking of is when I wake up in the morning and KQED is playing the accident report in East Bay or downtown San Francisco, when nobody really ought to be on the road, but in fact, the accidents seem to be clustering at all the bridges and along the more open roads. And I'm wondering if this technology could be developed for the driver as opposed to the car. One last comment. At the Energy Commission many years ago, we did a big study on whether or not insuring the driver rather than the driver rather than the vehicle, putting the cost of insurance at the gas pump would make sense. And it at least theoretically it made sense, but the insurance industry hated it, so it never got passed. So what if we focused on the driver and had technology that induced or encouraged better behavior, like don't drive fast when there's a pandemic going on? Thanks.
Thank you. These are great questions. Let me start with the first. Our model abstracts away the specific cause of a crash, and it really just asks, what will the fatality rate be? So it's really not asking, is it from electronics? Is it from poor weather? But simply says, what will the trend be? So we don't get to a level, to that micro level. So I can't answer that question for you. As far as supporting the driver, I'm a little confused by the question. Let me take a stab at it. For one, the vehicles that we describe in this model, we assume that there is essentially no driver, or that the driver does not need to pay attention. So what I didn't go through here is that, there's a bit of a taxonomy for autonomous vehicles, where a 0 is a traditional vehicle, 5 is a fully autonomous, no driver possible in the vehicle, and everything in between. So supporting the driver assumes that the driver and the vehicle are sharing responsibility with driving, and that's a level 2 vehicle or a level 3 vehicle. In general, those kinds of systems are actually kind of pretty dangerous, because what we continue to see is that people over rely on technology. So there are some things the vehicle could do, like let's avoid this road because there's a crash, you're speeding, beep, beep, beep. But in the end, people tend to do dumb things when they think the vehicle is in control. And that's why a lot of automakers, Tesla notwithstanding, are avoiding that kind of extra support to human drivers, because human drivers then become, frankly, lazy.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question from John Helveston. Please, John, go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Excellent presentation. I was just curious about if you know of any ongoing measures for how we might actually measure how good an AV is. How would we know when we're at that threshold where they're just better than humans? I know there's been, some measures like how long can an AV drive before it has to have a human intervention to prevent an accident. I know that there's different AV companies are using that as a metric. Have you seen any other metrics? Because I'm just curious I understand the measure in your model here, but how would we know where we've met that point?
Great question. Two responses to that. Two of our other reports, one is called Driving to Safety, and it asks the question, how many miles would you have to drive to essentially get close bounds on an estimate of a fatality rate? Basically, how many, and it's billions of miles. So the fatality rate is what we would call a lagging indicator. It's something that you can measure after the fact, but what we really need are leading indicators. And so we have a second report that develops a safety framework for measuring AV safety. And we talk about disengagements, which is what you're describing, which is how long can the vehicle drive before someone has to intervene? And is that, if it's 10 miles or 100 miles, is that a good measure of its safety? Disengages are unfortunately not a good measure for several reasons. One is different developers use disengagements differently. Some are trying to test the most dangerous cases, and therefore they'll disengage a lot. Some are testing on, clean open roads, and they'll disengage infrequently. It's also a perverse sort of incentive, because if you're measuring disengagements, you're incentivizing easy driving, when what we really want to do is incentivize hard driving, which might mean a lot of disengagements. Other measures might be things like good roadmanship. This is the idea that you're a good driver. It means, how often does the vehicle swerve out of its lane? How often does it come within this distance of another vehicle? So developing measures based on good roadmanship is another indicator. Injuries and crashes are also better than fatalities because they occur more frequently. So the report describes a few more things, but in general, what we're looking for are early indicators of poor performance. And simulation is also important here, but it's hard to use for regulators because different developers have different simulations, and we don't know what their fidelity is. Like, are these tracking closely to the real world? And do the scenarios that are being simulated represent hard problems? So it's a tough question, but we do have a couple of reports addressing these very issues.
Thank you very much. Let me go to one question on the Google form that is related to this, and it reads as follows. Developing ABs depends on how safe they are compared to traditional vehicles. However, decision makers often are reluctant to accept evidence that does not conform with their priors and their beliefs. How can this affect the diffusion of autonomous vehicles?
It's not only policymakers. I would say that's a cognitive bias that everyone has, is disregarding information that contradicts our beliefs. Boy, if I had the answer to that question, I would be a very wealthy woman. I mean, I could solve any problem. It's part of the answer for me, and especially coming from a place like RAND, is the belief that when you show people the objective evidence around their beliefs, they may listen, especially if what they are committed to is an outcome and they're less committed to the means to get there. But so often it's absolutely true that whether you think an autonomous vehicle is safe or not has almost nothing to do with what you know about their safety, but much more about sort of a person's beliefs and perspectives, how they see the world. So you might find weird correlations between a belief in autonomous vehicle safety and a belief in things like universal health care, gun control. They're often shaped by politics. I don't have a good answer to that, other than I think, well, one is continue to develop objective evidence and present it to the people in charge. And two, this is sort of an area that I'm interested in but have not done research in, which is trying to overcome cognitive biases, frankly, in my case, in Congress, particularly. How do we sort of move the wheels of this machinery that push people into ideological corners? How do we get them out of their corners by looking at evidence and research? Only questions, no answers.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. Actually, that's very wise. I have one more question on the Google Forms, but before reading that, I want to check with the audience if there's another question. Please just unmute your mic or raise your hand. Okay, so let me just go ahead and ask you this last question, Nidhi. When you have testified in Congress, what congressmen and congresswomen worry about the most?
Getting reelected? Oh, sorry. This isn't being recorded, is it? They truly,
Oh yeah, it is.
I'm teasing. Truly, they worry about their constituents' welfare. You know, they want to know, are the people in my district and my state going to be safe? And what can I do to make them safe and to increase their prosperity and their well-being? Again, these issues cleave along ideological lines. So you'll see a lot of people concerned about the effects on labor, and what will happen to, what will happen to professional drivers or people who make their living in driving vehicles. And will these technologies increase the wealth gap or not? And, I think we can expect that in many cases they will, but it depends on policy. So for example, are autonomous vehicles only going to be accessible to the wealthy? Or are they going to be deployed in lower income areas? Because these are actually places that could enormously benefit. People who can't drive, don't drive, can't afford a car, might suddenly be able to have access to jobs, training, education, healthcare, all the things they need that they otherwise can't get to because transit doesn't work. So there's a way in which autonomous vehicles can be used for upward social and economic mobility, but they can also exacerbate that. Other concerns are, is this a job creating industry? And how do we support autonomous vehicles? How do we get on board with the future of transportation technology? So these are all legitimate questions, but there is an ideological lean towards concerns. So rather than, what I see as unfortunate is, rather than trying to solve them as a whole, we have some groups that are concerned with one issue, other groups concerned with another issue, others with another. And we're not really focusing on the interactions between these different social and economic concerns. So these are all part of the same package. I haven't even talked about environmental impact, right? So autonomous vehicles are not just about safety. They're not just about jobs. They're about a whole lot of things that can't be looked at piecemeal. And yet that's what I see happening, is a legitimate but piecemeal concern for a wide range of social and economic issues.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. And that was a very instructive answer. Is there any other question on the audience? I think we can have one more if there is. If there isn't, let me just move on to a final message. I believe we're good to go. Nidhi, thank you very much for your time today.
Edwin, we got one more question.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, please go ahead.
Me again. I just thought, as a, maybe a thought experiment. I mean, I thought the simulation here was really compelling and really interesting, but I was thinking of, are there other alternative scenarios where the counterfactual is what we vary? Like, how do we make humans just safer? So we know, like, driving faster is a big factor, associated with fatalities. So if we just lowered the speed limits everywhere, would that have as big an effect? I'm just trying to think of some other things just to make the analysis, think of other possible outcomes.
Well, I can direct you to another report, which is called Road to Safety. And what this report looks at, what it would take, what combination of infrastructure, policy, technology would it take to bring road fatalities from nearly 40,000 today, 40,000 annually, to zero by, I think it's looking at by 2030, maybe a little longer, but it's asking exactly these same questions. Like, what if we turned intersections into roundabouts? What if AVs are deployed or not deployed? What if we lower speed limits? Importantly, a big difference, there's, other countries don't have quite the kind of problem with road safety that the US has, at least other sort of OECD countries. And that's in part because the US is a huge country. People drive like crazy. I mean, we drive, 3 trillion miles every year. The other is that we don't have a culture of transportation safety the way it exists in other countries. It's seen as a niche transportation issue rather than a public health issue. So it's transforming the cultural paradigm through which transportation safety is addressed, as well as a whole bunch of these other factors. So again, I'll just direct you to the report, Road to Safety at RAND.org.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're gonna conclude this webinar. Nidhi, thank you very much for your time. This has been a great session. Let me just conclude this webinar with a few announcements. Remember, next week we will have Julie Rosenberg's seminar on poverty reduction under deep uncertainty at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. So please be aware of the time difference. And just as concluding this, please submit your session proposals for DMDU 2020. The deadline is next Monday, and we are very excited to hear from you in terms of what would you like to, be the annual meeting structure around. Nidhi, thank you very much. This has been wonderful, and we appreciate a lot your time. We know you're very busy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay well.